Welcome to WhiskyCast, Cask Strength Conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 762 for April 7th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
I have 3 distillery operators. Their previous jobs were, one was a plumber, one of them baked cakes, and the other one was a bartender. And now, including myself and the 3 team members, we are making exceptional spirit. They have got the same drive, the same ambition as myself to make the best whisky coming out of Scotland. For me, there's no point in making whisky unless you want to be the best. Nobody wants to make a mediocre whisky. They all want to be making the best whisky, and that's what we're striving to do.
Gary Haggart has a unique place in whiskey history. When Lindores Abbey Distillery opened up next to the old abbey where Friar John Cor was making aqua vitae for the king way back in 1494, Gary Haggart became the new distillery's first manager. And that means no matter what happens at Lindores Abbey in the future, that is something no one will be able to take away from him. Gary Haggart presented his first master class with samples of Lindores Abbey Spirit a couple of weeks ago at the Wonderful World of Whisky show in Cornwall, Ontario. Our conversation is coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have highlights from Friday night's American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia, along with the calendar of events, your voice, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. If you're planning a trip to Islay and want to hit all of the open distilleries, make sure you leave some more time on your itinerary. That's because Ardnahoe Distillery near Port Eskeg is now open to visitors. The Hunter Lang & Company-owned distillery threw open the doors to its visitors center this week. The distillery itself has been in production since the beginning of the year, and getting that completed was the first priority. But over the last few weeks, Scott Lang has been watching anxiously to make sure the visitors center was ready in time for the Islay Festival at the end of next month.
We were slightly concerned there for a while, but because obviously the festival's so crucial economically speaking to the island and the distilleries, and it will be to us, of course. So it was essential that we got it open in time for the festival. So I'm just glad we have done, and it's good that we've got about a month and a half or so to let the team at the distillery bed in and get used to everything in terms of receiving visitors. So I'm pretty confident that we'll be in a good place by the time the festival rolls around and we've got the real numbers of visitors coming in.
So what are you going to do for your first Fitzgerald bottling?
The one that occurs in however many years. Well, I don't know. We'll have to see about that. Well, for this year, we're carrying on with our kinship range, which we've been doing for the last 2 years, and which has been very successful. The last 2 years, we've released 6 bottlings each of different distilleries, some on Islay, some not. So this year, we've got 6 more, and I think anyone who has tasted or heard about the previous 2 years of kinships, they won't be disappointed by this year. They're of the same ilk and quality, let's say. I won't say exactly what they are just yet, but they're of the same level.
By the way, they are putting all of the Ardnahoe new make into casks. You might get to taste some on a tour, but there are no plans to bottle any of it. Last time around, we had the early news on Bruichladdich expansion plans, including the construction of a floor maltings by 2023. Bruichladdich Managing Director Douglas Taylor told us this week that it just makes sense, given that malting barley is the one part of the whiskey-making process that they don't do now on the island.
We have this vertically integrated operation, and the maltings brings the missing piece of the jigsaw from a production point of view, but also adds employment from that side of things as well. So it's a real success story for Bruichladdich as it continues to go from strength to strength.
Now, this is going to take about 4 years. You're looking at putting the maltings in 2020 by 2023. What do you have to do between now and then?
So it's subject to planning permission, but we have to go through the process of finalising the designs and then understanding where it sits on the site, and then go through the planning process to get the sign-off from the local authority, permission to build it. And of course, then we start to go through the usual process of tendering for contractors, building, and then cutting the ribbon sometime in 2023. We hope that's the plan anyway.
Now, you also will realize some cost savings, theoretically, and energy savings as well from having that maltings on site, don't you? Because I think it's, about 42% of your barley comes from Islay now, and you have to ship that up to Inverness and then bring it back.
Yes, so it goes by road. It goes across from the ferry, and then it heads by road up to Inverness, and then it comes back. So whilst we do adopt some backhauling techniques when barley is being delivered from mainland grown barley being delivered malted from Beards, we do backhaul Islay barley back up. But yes, inevitably, this is a move that also reduces our carbon footprint, which I think can only be a good thing in today's context. And we are big advocates of sustainability at a global level. So instead of shipping Islay-grown barley all the way up to the northeast of Scotland, Inverness, to malt it and then bring it back, if we can malt it in small batches and keep the traceability of it in place locally on site on Islay, then that can only be a good thing, because that will reduce our carbon footprint and give us total control over the process.
That sustainability work will also include looking at whether renewable energy sources could supply more of the distillery's energy needs. There's a tidal energy study going on now along the western coast of Islay that Taylor believes could potentially be a significant source of electricity for the island in the future. And, by the way, Bruichladdich head distiller Adam Hennett will be leading an attempt to break the record for the world's biggest whiskey tasting this coming weekend. It'll be during the Gothenburg Beer and Whiskey Fair in Gothenburg, Sweden, on Saturday. In other news, Whistle Pig has released one of the last whiskeys that Dave Pickerell was working on before his death last November. Piggyback is a 6-year-old 100% rye whiskey that comes from Dave Pickerell's work over the years with bartenders. It's bottled at 48.28% ABV and will carry a recommended retail price of $49.99 a bottle. I received a sample late this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website.
So we've talked a lot about Pennsylvania rye at these conventions over the years, and I'm joined right now by Mike Smith of Barrel 21 Distilling in State College, Pennsylvania, and a longtime friend, Herman Mihalich of Dad's Hat in Bristol, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. You guys are part of a really unique project last week out in Washington, Pennsylvania at Liberty Pole Spirits. Washington, of course, is the home of the Whiskey Rebellion. Tell me about this project. You guys blended your ryes together.
Correct.
Right. Why?
Well, we just thought it was a great idea from Jim and Ellen Huff at Liberty Pole. They wanted to do something to help support the local Whiskey Rebellion Festival and the Historical Society out there. And I think Ellen had the idea of creating this blend of several different rye whiskeys made across the state, and then donating the proceeds from the sale of that blend to the local festival, which commemorates the Whiskey Rebellion locally.
Mike, what makes this project so unique for you guys?
We're a pretty young distillery, as a lot of them are here in Pennsylvania, but a lot of it was getting together, having that community, and seeing what other people are doing. Everyone's making great whiskeys. As we tasted them all before we blended them, and each one had such different characteristics. They were all rye whiskey, but there were so many different paths that people were taken to get there. So it was really interesting to see that. And then, as Herman said, the cause was incredible. So it was really a great thing to be a part of.
Your neighbors to the north up in New York about a year or so ago came up with this Empire Rye informal designation. Could we see something like that in Pennsylvania? Because Pennsylvania really is known for rye whiskey.
Well, we didn't have to make it up. It already exists. In Pennsylvania Rye, as already has, it's not an official appellation either, but I think it's pretty well recognized already. So we use it as part of the historical backstory that we all have, and we haven't really formally had to really create something because it's been there for 300 years.
When will people get a chance to taste this Whiskey Rebellion Festival Rye?
I believe it goes on sale in a couple weeks.
Is it April 10th, I think, pre-sales go on?
Pre-sale.
Online, they can sign up for that.
But they won't get the delivery until later.
Until the festival, I believe.
Yeah, the festival's in July.
Yeah. Okay, so you guys are going to let it sit for a while.
Yeah.
Okay.
We took one of the 53-gallon barrels from Dad's hat that we have just emptied from. It was a 2014 fill. We used that as the blending barrel. So we all added whiskey to that already used barrel to try to harmonize things a bit before it's sold, before it's bottled in later in the year. The pre-sale starts now, but that's just a
right.
You buy into it, but they're letting it sit in the barrel for a little while longer.
Right, absolutely.
And the festival is in July, of course.
I believe it's the weekend of July 11 and 12, which is my birthday, by the way.
So you'll be able to go out and celebrate your birthday.
I'm planning that. Yes, I am.
And we have the dates for that festival on the calendar, along with a link to the website for the festival.
Yep.
Where can people order this one if they want to get their hands on it?
I believe it's on the festival website.
Okay.
That's where the link is, but I think the sales are going through Liberty Pole.
Okay.
Yeah, just from a regulatory and keeping it all
legal. Yeah. Yeah, I got to keep that legal part there.
Yes, we would pay attention to that stuff. Yep.
Well, guys, thank you for doing this. I appreciate you coming over and taking time away from your booths. So we'll come over and taste some whiskeys later on. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely.
Thank
it's
you,
our
Mark.
pleasure.
See you.
We'll have more highlights from Friday night's American Whiskey Convention in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, Compass Box announced a new release on Monday that had a lot of people thinking April Fools. It's not, though. Affinity is a blend that combines Scotch whiskey with French Calvados from Domaine Christian Drouin, and it comes from John Glazer's habit of blending the two for use at home and in the Compass Box blending room in London. Here's a quick backstory. During the 2017 Whiskey Show in London, I was in the room when John Glazer poured what turned out to be an early version of Affinity during his master class. The consensus in the room at the time? Bottle it. It's good. The limited edition Affinity will sell in the UK with a recommended retail price of £100 a bottle. The US version will be priced at around $150. The English Whiskey Company is releasing a new Virgin Oak Matured single malt. It's 6 years old. Only 2,689 bottles will be available at a recommended retail price of £52. That's around $68 a bottle at current exchange rates. Napog Castle is releasing a new 12-year-old Irish single malt that is finished in Marsala wine casks from Italy's Marco di Bartoli winery. 1,020 bottles will be available. The recommended retail price, around $80 a bottle. Japan's Mars Distillery has two new single malts. The Komagatake Yakushima Aging 2019 single malt is a cask-strength bottling at 58% ABV, while the Mars Malt Le Papillon 2019 is a 4-year-old single cask bottling. The 5th edition of Luxco's Blood Oath Bourbon is on its way to retailers. This year's edition blends 9, 11, and 13-year-old bourbons, and master blender John Rempe did something unusual with the 9-year-old before blending the three.
I was able to get a hold of some awesome aged rum barrels from down in the Caribbean, and sent them up here and put some 9-year-old whiskey in there and let it sit in there for just a little bit over 6 months this time. And it just really gives the Pack 5 really nice brown sugar, dark fruit, plum prune flavors to it. I think it's awesome.
Is this the first time you've worked with rum barrels?
Yes, it is.
So there was some experimentation there too, right? You weren't quite sure.
Oh, yeah.
Were you quite sure what you were going to get, or what?
No, I really wasn't, and I was, I had some backup plans also, but it turned out very, very nicely. I was very, very pleased with it.
And you saved the backup plan for next year, right?
Yeah, I've got several backup plans.
You always have to have a backup plan, right?
Exactly, yep.
Blood Oath Pact number 5 is bottled at 49.3% ABV and will have a recommended retail price of $99.99 a bottle. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at WhiskyCast.com. We reported back in January that Berry Brothers and Rudd CEO Dan Jago was stepping down, with Lizzie Rudd taking over as executive chairman of the Wine and Spirits Company on an interim basis. Now you can remove the interim tag. The drinks business reports Berry Brothers directors have called off their search for a new CEO, and Rudd will continue to run the company on a day-to-day basis. Also, Beam Suntory completed its executive suite change this week. As we reported last fall, CEO Matt Shattuck is stepping down and has been replaced by former Chief Operating Officer Albert Bellotti. Shattuck will stay with the company as its non-executive chairman. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Tickets are still available for the Whiskey Obsession Festival this week in Sarasota, Florida. It runs Wednesday through Saturday night. The Whiskey Extravaganza's Spring Series gets underway on Thursday night in New York City. The Wine and Spirits Show is this coming weekend in London, along with the Bristol Whiskey Festival on Saturday in Bristol, England. Maker's Mark Distillery has its annual Handcraft Festival on Saturday, too. That's at the distillery in Loretto, Kentucky. Harissa Restaurant in Los Angeles hosts a Passover kosher wine and whiskey dinner on the 15th. The Kilkenny Whiskey Guild has an evening with Walsh Whiskey on the 18th at Kilkenny's Paris, Texas Whiskey Bar. Whiskey on Ice is April 20th in Bloomington, Minnesota. There's a Port Escague 10th anniversary tasting at Brown's Covent Garden in London on the 23rd. The Nth Ultimate Whiskey Experience is April 26th and 27th in Las Vegas. And finally, the Whiskey Fair Limburg is on April 27th and 28th in Limburg, Germany. Right now, we have 181 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just use the search button to find events near you or wherever you're traveling over the next year.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. You won't read a book on the history of Scotch whiskey without seeing at least one reference to Friar John Cor and the 8 bowls of malt he was granted to make aqua vitae for the king in 1494 at Lindores Abbey. 525 years later, that one entry in the Exchequer Roll remains the oldest known written reference to whiskey distilling in Scotland. Today there is whiskey being distilled once again at Lindores Abbey. You'll find my 2017 conversation with Drew Mackenzie Smith in our archives. It's in episode 654. He built a new distillery next to the ruins of the old abbey on his family's farm near Fife, and hired Gary Haggart to be its first manager. Gary was one of the featured presenters at the recent Wonderful World of Whisky show in Cornwall, Ontario. In fact, it was not only Gary's first master class, but the first time spirit from Lindores Abbey has been presented at a whiskey festival. Gary and I sat down after his master class to talk.
Before we talk about what's going on at the distillery now, let's talk about your history, because you have a pretty interesting history of bouncing between whiskey and the oil and gas industry in Scotland. Obviously, Scotland's 2 biggest industries, but go through the CV for me here. I know you started out at Dewars as an electrical engineer, not a chemical engineer.
No, not at all. No, I started off as an electrical engineer at Dewars of Perth. I was there for almost 2 to 3 years. After there, I moved down to the bigger packaging plant at Lagavulin in Fife, where I was a team leader, process tech, still on the engineering side, and I did that for almost 15 years. But growing up in the town of Blair Athol, I had Dalwhinnie Distillery, Blair Athol Distillery, Edgedower, Aberfeldy, all very close to me. And it must have resonated with me because I had this, I want to know what it's like to run a distillery, and I felt maybe even slightly destined to run a distillery, to be honest with you. So the opportunity came up to go to Speyside and run Cragganmore Distillery, which I done. I was up there for just over a year and a half. I was there during the winter of 2010-2011, which was a very hard winter, to be honest with you. One of my first jobs when I got up there was to actually order a large tractor with a snowplough and a spreader to make sure that we kept the road open. So I knew we were probably in for some pretty bad weather, yeah. From there, unfortunately, things just didn't quite work out, and I decided to go into the oil and gas. At that time, it was booming as well, and found myself travelling the world, working for an American company called National Oil Varco. We were doing installation and commissioning of drilling equipment on the oil rigs. Unfortunately, the oil and gas industry took a slight nosedive as well. But even during these 5 or 6 years, during the oil and gas, I always had this itch that said malt distilling. I missed it, to be honest with you. So when the opportunity came up for a new distillery being opened less than 25 minutes from my house with this amazing history, I thought, yeah, here's my opportunity. And as they say, the rest is history. So I am the first distillery manager at Lindores in 525 years, and it's a big responsibility, but very much one that I'm enjoying.
But how did you make the transition from electrical engineer to distiller back in the day? Because that's not a transition that most people make within the industry.
Electrical, you have a process understanding, you've got a technical understanding, so I had that, but I also went away and studied. So I'd done the general certificate in distilling, so I had the theoretical background in it as well. I went and did that off my own back because I knew it was something that I needed to do to make people believe that, yes, this person genuinely wants to be a distillery manager. And I knew my first day at Cragganmore Distillery, I knew I'd made the right decision. I knew this is where I belonged, this is what I wanted to do, and I'm very, very confident this will be me until the day I decide enough's enough. When that is, I do not know. I have joked with Helen and Drew that when the spirit gets to maybe 15 or even 18 years in the cask, that's probably when I'll call it a day. I think I've done my bit. I've got that spirit up to that fantastic age, and I can I can retire confidently knowing that, yeah, myself and my team managed to do that.
How did you build the team, being the first manager at Lindores?
That's really interesting. I mean, today we've done our nosing and tasting, and people have managed to see what we're all about. So I have 3 distillery operators. Their previous jobs were, one was a plumber, one of them baked cakes, and the other one was a bartender. And now, including myself and the 3 team members, we're making exceptional spirit. They have got the same drive, the same ambition as myself to make the best whisky coming out of Scotland. For me, there's no point in making whisky unless you want to be the best. Nobody wants to make a mediocre whisky. They all want to be making the best whisky, and that's what we're striving to do.
So how do you do it? I know that Jim Swan was there at the start, but he has left us. How do you do it at Lindores?
We have a bit of autonomy, so we're not scared to experiment. We've not got the big corporate over the top of us making sure that we're hitting production targets, we're hitting efficiency targets. We're able to take things a little bit longer, a little bit slower. We've been very, very fortunate. Some people might call it luck, but very, very quickly we found ourselves with a good spirit, and we were able to enhance that spirit again to where we thought, yeah, we're really happy where it was. Jim Swan had set us up with some fantastic casks. I've also got the autonomy to go and source different casks so we can experiment. And I'm quietly confident, as I said earlier, that there is something in our arsenal at the warehouse that's going to knock people's socks off in the future. We have this amazing history of Friar John Cor in 1494, but for ourselves we feel it's important that the whisky has to be able to do the talking in the future.
Had the chance to try your new make today, and it was stunning, very complex, very well-rounded, full of flavor, and I know part of that comes from the fermentations, because unlike a lot of distilleries that have one standard stock fermentation time, you're doing 2 really different and long fermentations, right?
That's correct, yes. So we realised when we first did our distillation through the low wines, it nosed and tasted like pear drops, which is a boiled sweet in Scotland, and it was very one-dimensional. Now we know to get fruitiness, it needs long fermentations and a clear wort. We knew we were already doing the clear wort. We do a process that's called Vorloff. So that's where we take the wort out the bottom of the mash tun and return it back into the top. So instead of taking through the solids to the washback, we just return them to the top, and we keep this process running for about 20-30 minutes till we've got a lovely clear wort. Once we see that clear wort, we just forward it on to the washback. But then we decided, okay, we could potentially use wine yeasts and different yeasts to help with the fruitiness and the complexity of the spirit. But the correct way, the old traditional way, is to do long fermentations, and that's exactly what we did. So we have 1 fermentation at 96 hours and 3 fermentations at 114 hours. And that's right on the upper limit of how long you want to be taking a fermentation. But we found out it changed the complexity of our spirit immensely. It went from pear drops to pear drops, coconut, mango, banana, pineapple. It's just a fantastic spirit.
And that's different from what Jim had come up with originally as the base plan for the distillery, right?
Yeah, the base plan was 272 hours and 296 hours, but we just, to us, it wasn't working. Jim didn't have the luxury of actually being able to see what the distillery was giving him. We did have that luxury, and that's where we decided as a team, okay, here's what we're going to do.
So what legacy did Jim leave you when he passed to continue into the future?
The best legacy he left me was being able to get my hands on fantastic casks. So we use a mixture of bourbon, first fill sherry butts, and a cask that Jim very much pioneered called an STR, which is short for shaved, toasted and recharred. And this is a great cask for helping accelerate young spirit. It's ex-wine barriques. It works very, very well. Jim also wanted us to have a combination of the 3 casks and bring them together to make our own Lindores Classic, as he called it. And already we're finding that the combination of these 3 casks is working very, very well. So that was the greatest legacy Jim left me, was almost the cask portfolio.
In 1 email, right?
Yes, 1 email, unfortunately. We were expecting, it was such a shame when we lost the late Dr. Jim Swan, and we were expecting a big handover folder, but Jim obviously kept a lot of work up in his head, and when handover time came, it literally was a single email. But the email contained very, very important information that at least gave us some direction to go forward.
And you have his portrait still in the distillery.
We do, yes. It's one of the things, I believe it was Richard Patterson, he got everyone involved to sign Jim's portrait, and that hangs up in the distillery as an acknowledgement to what, because Lindores was one of his last distilleries, and I'm sure he would have been very, very proud of what we're doing at Lindores.
That's part of his legacy, but the legacy of Lindores goes back almost 1,000 years, 900 years or so, yes. Doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the abbey itself was built in 1191 for the Trinsian monks from the town of Tiron-Gardie in France. They were learned people. They knew how to brew, they knew how to distill, they kept bees, they kept cattle, they were great traders. They took salmon from the Tay, traded that for spices. They were very learned people. And then we come to this very significant point in 1494, where a certain Friar John Cor was granted 8 balls of malt to make aqua vitae for King James IV. And this is written in the Exchequer Roll, which is it is viewed as the earliest written historical evidence of distillation and potentially whisky being made in Scotland. And for us, it's a great accolade to have, but it also puts pressure on us, because if we're seen as the birthplace, the spiritual home, we have to make damn sure that what we release is worthy of that.
And you're actually, instead of gin, making aqua vitae now as part of that legacy.
Yes, we are. We decided that gin and vodka didn't quite fit in with what we were doing as a distillery. We've got this amazing historical reference to aqua vitae, so why not go and make aqua vitae? So we acquired a recipe that was some 250 years old. We tried to replicate it. Obviously, the human palate has developed significantly over these 250 years, and we just felt it needed a little bit more work. So Tim Foster, our apothecary, he did further work. He brought together further and different herbs and spices. We then added in dried fruits like dates and raisins, which gives it a natural sweetness, a natural colour. There is no cask maturation at all. Everything just macerates for almost 2 to 3 weeks and then simply bottled.
So if the pressure is on to make sure that first release of single malt from Lindores Abbey is, as you put it, damn good, how long can you wait?
That is a question that everyone asks me. I would love to get it. Well, yeah, I'm quietly confident that we will have very good whisky after the 3 years and 1 day. In an ideal world, I would like to take it to 5 years. But we'll just need to wait and see what the future holds.
And that 3 years and 1 day is December of next year and December 2020. So realistically, we're looking at 2021 before we see anything.
Yes, I think so. I think it's going to be sort of June, July 2021 before people will see the first release of the Lindores malt, and that first release will only go to the members of the 1494 membership. They have donated to help us preserve the Abbey, and as a reward for that, we will make sure that they receive the first ever bottling of Lindores single malt.
You showed some photos of the distillery, and the stillhouse windows look out on what's left of the old abbey. What does it look like to you in the morning when you're working the early shift and the sun comes up and you see the abbey wall outside your office and outside the still room?
To be honest with you, there is no better view. I'm able to stand there, normally with a cup of coffee in my hand, just looking over the grounds, looking over the abbey, and being able to almost connect. You know, it's been 525 years, but that time becomes very, very short when you're able to actually stand there and look at it. And then beyond that, you have the beautiful silvery Tay and then the Grampian Mountains again in the background. And it's a magical place to just sit and contemplate, to be honest with you. There is something spiritual about the place, definitely.
And last year you found some history that really actually goes back to the distilling days at the Abbey, right?
Absolutely. So we were digging a hole for a pond, to be honest with you, and the digger quickly unearthed some stones. We've always had to have an archaeologist on site when we're doing some excavation work, so work was stopped immediately. The archaeologist was brought in. We slowly started to realise that we were unearthing a hole in the ground, but this hole in the ground was stone-lined, and it had the shape and the runoff where you would look at it and go, that could be potentially where a still was heated. So we brought in some more specialist people, professional people to try and get a view on it. We had some carbon dating done of some of the materials found at the bottom, and the area where we believe that was where the historical still was. That's where Friar John Cor or the brewers were distilling and brewing. They've carbon dated some material. It is 15th century. It's been proven that there is cereals in there as well. So I can see that from our still house, and again, you can quickly connect between what's there and what's in the still house. It's pretty wild, to be honest with you.
You stumbled for a second there on my still house, our still house. When you're the first manager at a distillery, as it's starting up in operations, you really do have sort of an ownership stake in the place, don't you?
Absolutely. First and foremost, my job every day is to make sure that everyone goes home with their 10 fingers and their 10 toes. That's very, very important to me, that the health and safety of the distillery and the people that work there. So a lot does lie on my shoulders, and that does come first, and the spirit comes second. It can be a dangerous place to work at times. We are working with ethanol. It's a dangerous substance. It's a flammable substance. I'm touching wood as we talk about this, and I'm sure nothing will ever happen. But you have to be wary with what you're working with. So yeah, I do take a lot of that responsibility on my shoulders.
But I mean, in terms of the ownership of the spirit, too, I mean, you have as much in this, perhaps not as much as Drew and Helen Smith, the owners of the Abbey and the distillery, but you have a stake in this too, don't you?
Ultimately, yes, I suppose I do. I have the final decision on the spirit, but we're very much a team, and I will listen to all views. And if somebody thinks that something could be better, we've got the guys very much want to be part of it, and I hear sometimes a lot of people, and that's why I corrected myself talking about my spirit and my distillery and my whiskey. A distillery will not operate unless it takes everyone working together, and that's why I changed it to our, and that's why I like to talk about the team.
But you'll be regarded as, history writes the story of the modern Lindores Abbey, as the first manager, probably the first manager to get the name on the bottle of that first release, and you'll be the one that they go down in history, that when the next malt whiskey yearbook, whoever takes over from Ingvar in 100 years or whatever, is writing about Lindores Abbey, they're going to write about you as the first manager.
Yeah, I suppose that's very true, and I never looked at it that way. I'm a little bit humbled by that, to be honest with you, and proud at the same time. It will be my legacy. It will be hopefully something that people will remember. And the one thing I'm looking very much forward to is when whiskey releases come out in that 15, 18, 21 years' time, and I'll be able to recall what we did that day, what cask we put it into, why we did it, and be able to tell the story about it, and that will be exciting. I'll be an old man, probably sitting in my seat, but I'm looking forward to that as well.
Beats the hell out of choppering out to an offshore oil rig in the middle of the North Sea, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that was never... Don't get me wrong, I actually enjoy flying, and I used to enjoy flying in the helicopter, but every 4 years we had to go into a swimming pool where they would turn the helicopter upside down and you had to get out. I was never really a fan of that, but yeah, it's definitely... It's an easier way to make a living going to... And to be honest with you, I enjoy my drive every morning going towards the distillery. I do not view it as a job at all. I've always said that you have to want to be a distillery manager. If you don't want to be it, you're as well being something else. It can be a very challenging, a very long day sometimes. But for me, I genuinely feel it's my calling.
Thanks to Gary Haggart of Lindores Abbey Distillery for spending some time with us on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. The final season of Game of Thrones is just a few days away. Look for the House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old at a whiskey shop near you. It's just one of 8 whiskeys in the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whiskey collection from Diageo and HBO. Check out the entire range at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with one of the other whiskeys in that collection, the House Greyjoy Talisker Select Reserve. It's bottled at 45.8% ABV. The nose is oaky with notes of dark chocolate, campfire smoke, and a hint of barbecued beef. The taste has a hint of campfire smoke, chili powder, and white pepper spices, balanced by grilled fruits, toasted caramel, and just a hint of honey. The finish is long, complex, and smoky, with hints of pipe tobacco and old leather. It's excellent. I'm scoring the House Greyjoy Talisker Select Reserve a 94. By the way, you'll find my tasting notes for the rest of that Game of Thrones series at WhiskyCast.com. Now, during the news, we heard from Mike Smith of Barrel 21 Distillery in State College, Pennsylvania, along with Herman Mihalich of Dad's Hat. Here's the thing. When I was asking Herman about his barrel picking for the next edition of Dad's Hat Bottled in Bond Rye that's coming later this year, the first thing Herman did was to say, wait, I want to brag on Mike's rye for a minute. When one distiller starts talking about a colleague's whiskey like that, you tend to pay attention. So I went over and got a sample from Mike. His 2-year-old Woodcock Straight Rye is bottled at 46% ABV, and Mike Smith uses 6 different types of yeast in his fermentation. The result? A tart and floral whiskey with a nose of toasted bread and butter, dried flowers, linseed oil, lemon drop candies, muted spices, and just a hint of charred oak. The taste is tart and floral with lemon pepper spice, hints of clove and cinnamon, dried flowers, linseed oil, and a slightly herbal touch. The finish is long with subtle spices and a lemony tartness. It's a really interesting whiskey. Herman was right. I'm scoring Barrel 21's Woodcock Straight Rye a 92. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the new Balcones Texas Pot Still Straight Bourbon during the news, and I received a sample of it recently. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has good spices, along with hints of tobacco, leather, honey, and vanilla. The taste is thick and oily with good spices, honey and caramel sweetness, and those same hints of leather and tobacco in the background. The finish fades away nicely with a good balance of spices and sweetness. I'm scoring the Balcones Texas Pot Still Bourbon a 93. Let's wrap it up with the spring 2019 release of Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond Bourbon. This whiskey is 13 years old, and it was distilled back in the fall of 2005. Of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has good spices balanced nicely by charred oak, leather, pipe tobacco, honey, and just a hint of cocoa beans. The taste is spicy with cinnamon, black pepper, and a hint of chili powder, along with a touch of honey underneath the spices that comes out more as those spices fade. There's also a nice touch of chocolate-covered cherries that lasts through the finish. I'm scoring the Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond Spring 2019 edition a 93. I've added these whiskeys to my tasting notes for more than 2,500 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, and instead of opening up the inbox this week, we're going to do something a bit different. We took our remote studio setup to the American Whiskey Convention Friday night at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, not just to interview distillers, but also to sit down and talk with some of you.
I'm Rob Wysick.
What have you tasted so far, Rob?
I've gone to Old Scout, Buffalo Trace, obviously, Old Elk.
What did you think of the Old Elk?
I thought that was interesting. I haven't seen them around, so it was nice to try something new. And they were the first taste I had for the night, so it was very good. I'd like to learn more about them.
What do you get out of a show like this?
It's finding people that have the same interest. I've been drinking bourbon for 15, 20 years, but it was sort of the same brand for 10 of those years. And so in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been trying different types and different distilleries and sort of expanding my palate. And these conventions are a great way of tasting a lot in a short period of time.
How did you develop your love? When did you know that you were a bourbon geek?
When I did
I use that term nicely.
And I do. So I have a PhD in chemistry, and so about 5-6 years ago, I did a distillery tour at Ranger Creek Distillery in San Antonio, and to me it was just like, okay, this is my education meeting my passion at the same time. And as that kind of, once that kind of made sense, I started going to more and more distillery tours to where, I design vacations based on how many distilleries are in that one city. So I can, even though it's some of the information is the same, I'm still learning things each time. And, I'm still an amateur when it comes to like the distillation field, but I feel like I do come with a scientific background as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know more about it than the average drinker. You don't have to be explained the basics.
Right.
I'm Jeff Lichtman, JeffreyScottWhiskey.com, and Philadelphia Whiskey Society.
Okay, and Rob?
Robert Schwartz, South Jersey Bourbon Drinkers.
How did you guys wind up drinking whiskey years and years ago? How did you get hooked on it?
April 1991. I'm an attorney. My firm was throwing a party. Senior partner has a bar in his office. He had a case of Glenlivet 18 after a multi-million-dollar verdict, and the guy that referred the case to him sent him the case of whiskey. Glenlivet 18 on a little bit of ice. The monster was born and refined his palate a little bit over the years.
And you, Rob?
I started out with, I guess beer and wine, and then went to cognac, and then found my way to bourbon. My first one that hooked me was Maker's 46, and I go, wow, this is great. And then, continued down that path.
Down the old rabbit hole, right?
Hell yeah.
Now, tell me about the best whiskey you've tasted tonight.
Wow.
Tough call.
It is a tough call. I've tasted a lot of these already before, so I will say not the best, but the most impressive for what it is. There was a guy out there that has a 1-year-old rye that I was very impressed with. Shady Knoll. Fantastic. It's a port finish for a 1-year rye in a port finish. I loved it for what it was.
Okay.
So, was it the best for what it was? Absolutely. Was it for the best itself? It's up to discussion.
And you're still tasting tonight, too.
Hell yeah.
And you're sipping a Westland.
I am a huge fan of Westland, in my opinion. Best malt whiskey made in the United States. Always a go-to for me at an American whiskey. But the Widow Jane 12 was delicious. And also a friend of mine was pouring the Midwinter's Night Dram.
Oh, the High Westland.
Yeah, and Rob is one of the people who beat me up to try more ryes. And that's a good one.
That's a great rye. I love the Midwinters.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of good ryes around here tonight.
I'm very, very lightly tasting this evening, and I'm picking and choosing with some degree of care and caution. But also another one that I would tell you that you really want to try, the Manitawny still works. They are doing some really nice things.
Yeah.
And they've got some good whiskeys here tonight.
I have to bust your chops just a little bit. Not just for being a lawyer, but you're the only guy here tonight wearing a kilt at an American whiskey show where there's no scotches around. That takes guts. Not to mention it's kind of cold outside.
Well, there's a lot of potential ways to answer that. I'm just going to go the cautious route and say these things are a lot warmer than you'd think.
Unless you get an updraft.
It's cold in Scotland.
Guys, thanks for stopping by, and enjoy the rest of the night.
It's a pleasure, and it's great listening to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Michael Moore.
Tell me how you got hooked on whiskey in the first place. What got you past just doing shots in the bar with your buddies to becoming a connoisseur?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a connoisseur, but what got me here is the story of whiskey. And I thoroughly enjoy the concept behind how it's made and the distilleries and the history behind it. And I'll go to Telmadou for an example, if I pronounce that correctly. It's all very fascinating, and I think drinking is really not so much maybe about how much you know. It's about how much you connect with your friends and different aspects. And so that's how I ended up here. My buddy is a huge bourbon and whiskey guy. And I'm a huge drinker of all things alcohol. So I ended up here with him in support of him. So that's how I'm here.
Even though you're an Irish whiskey guy.
I am an Irish whiskey guy, I won't lie. I mean, I like Telmadou, and I just sat in a very complex course, actually. I walked into a room by accident in this fantastic building. The Penn Museum is amazing. And I walked into a room, and they sat me at a table. I said, "What am I doing?" They said, "You're going to drink some old whiskey," and I had a great time. They taught me a lot of things about what I was indulging in, but it was fascinating. This whole place is amazing, isn't it?
So, what's the best whiskey you've tried tonight?
The best whiskey I tried tonight. That's a great question. I drank in Knob Creek, and I don't want to say I know exactly what it was, but I'll give you how it played out. I went up to the table, and me not knowing too much, they give you a nice glass, and I said, I'll gladly drink whatever you pour me, I suppose. And my buddy walked up, and he's like, the first selection's no good, the second selection's fantastic, the third, so it was already like a heated debate amongst the people who knew what they were doing. But I sat up, and they poured me a fine drink in Knob Creek. To them out there, I love your drinks. It's fantastic. So that was the best I've had so far.
Hi. I didn't mean to interrupt you guys. I just want to say hi because I listen to your podcast all the time. I'm with Dad Towers.
Sit down.
Yeah.
No, you should sit down.
Sit down.
No, please, there's a seat.
Come on. No, if you're gonna interrupt.
No, if you're gonna walk up, you gotta sit down.
If you're gonna walk up.
No, you walked up. You gotta sit down.
You walked up here. Come on.
It's all family. No, you're in it now. So there's a young lady who walked up, and she's a lovely person. She's fabulous. She's going to sit down.
Come on, sit down.
She's going to sit down. She's going to sit down. You can't not sit down at this point. It's not peer pressure. It's family. We're all family now. I feel like we all bonded just now.
Okay, so we're making her put the headphones on so she can hear. Now, what's your name?
Here's a brief explanation. Heidi Grau of Dad's Hat Rye sat down to join us, but I had forgotten to turn her microphone on for a couple of minutes. And by the time I realized that, Michael Moore had taken over the interview.
Yeah, did you ever critique him where you're like, Dad, now, I don't know. It's not the best batch now.
And there were certain points where I was like, that one's a little too much for me, or this one's a little too fruity for me. But that's why we blend them to make Dad's Hat what it is.
Well, I'm just sitting here enjoying this because I'm not having to ask any questions here, Michael.
No, you're doing a fantastic job now. Now, you gave me the mic, so I'm going to run with it.
Yeah.
Now,
and you got me on the mic.
When you grow up in that industry, what are some things you notice when you're walking around? You're in a place like this. You look around. I'm fascinated because I'm new to all of this. And this Penn Museum, you're here.
Yes.
What do you think? Like, what is it blowing your mind that you're here? Is it your first time at Penn Museum in a setting like this, or no?
This is my first time at this specific museum. What blows my mind, I love the turnout. And it's nice that I think that people don't necessarily get to try everything. that they want to try. They're not going to just go and pick up a bottle if you've never had it. So this is a nice event where they can try everything out and see what they like and what they don't like.
Okay, Heidi, I'm going to bring up the gender thing for a second here.
Okay.
You know where we're going with this.
Nobody does.
Okay, because, no.
It's a surprise.
If you listen to the show, we had Kat Augustin, who works as a brand ambassador on the West Coast, on a couple weeks ago.
I've listened to that before.
Yeah, you heard the show, so you know where we're going with this.
Yes.
What's the dumbest thing a guy has done to you at one of these shows? When you're behind the stand, what's happened to you?
Sometimes I get the question, do you work for the distillery, or are you one of those promo models? Like, I work for the distillery. I actually know what I am talking about. I'm not saying that the promo models don't. Some of them do, some of them don't. But, yeah, there hasn't been too many instances where people have been disrespectful. So I've been lucky. Then I usually have the guys behind me, too, that have my back. So, yeah.
And when somebody acts up, they or says something stupid, Herman and the boys shut them down, right?
They can. I can handle my own sometimes. I have my comments where I'm, very nonchalant and subtle, but usually at the point.
Passive-aggressive stuff, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in a nice way.
Well, like we refer to as East Coast sweet.
Yes.
Where you can make it sound so sugary sweet, but you've just been kneecapped.
Yeah.
Well, nobody's asked me if I'm a promo model, so I don't know how to take that.
Really?
Is that
I'm
a
surprised.
sexist thing? I don't know.
I figured
I'm standing behind all of these whiskey and bourbon,
I'm
and I want
you've
some
never
of
been asked that question.
I'm blushing. Can that show up? Truly, I don't know. I'm a fan, though. I like what she has to say.
Well, guys, thank you for stopping by here, and enjoy the rest of the show. Heidi,
thank
get
you.
back to the stand because Herman's going to come over here looking for you soon.
Probably.
So,
well, thank you very much. I
thank
appreciate
you, Michael. Too,
No,
as
thank
well.
you for letting me sit in. It's
Okay.
nice.
Thanks, guys. Have
Thank
fun.
you.
I really want to thank everyone who stopped by to say hello the other night, and those were just a few of the people we talked with. We may share some more of those conversations on an upcoming episode or two. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Behind the label is our look each week at the science, history, and all that other stuff that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And once again, let's go back to Friday night's American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia.
We talk a lot about rye whiskey in Pennsylvania, but you really can't talk about rye whiskey in America without talking about the distiller of his country, George Washington and George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon. I'm joined now by Steve Bishore, who runs the distillery at Mount Vernon, and Lisa Wicker, our friend from Widow Jane and Sampson and Surrey, who also serves as the head distiller, or the master distiller at Mount Vernon. Tell me about the Bourbon Project, because we know James Anderson, who was George Washington's distillery manager, did a rye whiskey back in the day. But you guys put together a bourbon, didn't you, Lisa?
We did. Steve is always poring over all the old records and everything, and one of my thank you gifts at Mount Vernon for spending some time there, they took me to the library and they pulled George Washington's distillery ledger out for me. It was a pretty profound day, and flipped through there, and Steve on another day has been reading and found out that they had been using some wheat tailings and kind of opened up the door to do some bourbon.
Because you don't have to be historically 100% accurate as long as you're using the original methods, right, Steve?
Yeah, that's true. And also, we'd already made single malt whiskey a few years ago, a special project, so I felt like we could go a little bit out of the box. But once I found the reference that Lisa spoke of, that they didn't have enough rye in 1797, so they used the wheat tailings and corn, and that built on a bourbon-type mash bill. Of course, bourbon didn't exist then as a class of whiskey, but it gave us something to hang history on.
So you guys aren't going to try to claim that bourbon was invented in Mount Vernon, Virginia, then?
Sure we will.
Yeah. Well, not at Mount Vernon, but there's some references to what would be called bourbon in the 17th century, but I think the name is definitely...
You can try it once.
Yeah.
But...
Well, I don't want to anger people. We are at a whiskey event. So
and Lisa still spends half her year in Bardstown, so
yeah.
we'd like her to avoid not having her tires slashed in the bourbon capital of the world.
That's right. That's
Very
right.
true.
Most of my time's in Brooklyn these days. But,
right.
Yeah, about 85%. I'm going to jump back, too, on the title thing. Steve's the head distiller at Mount Vernon. I am the consulting distiller at Mount Vernon. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I thought Steve had one of these fancy titles like Director of
Oh, he has
Distillery
that, too.
Projects and
He's also the
Heritage
Director of Trades,
Director of Heritage
He's also-
Crafts and stuff like that.
Master Miller and Director of Trades and all those sorts of titles.
So that's where I was going from
And,
that.
and
But,
with my high salary, I do a lot of manual labor. Which
Yeah.
Is, yeah. But
and you get to wear the fun costume, too.
yeah, those, as I jokingly say, are my regular clothes, so I feel out of place a little bit without them. But we had talked about bourbon for over a year, actually, I think, because we wondered about it, and the records were telling us something, and then we realized it would have been called corn whiskey in that day, but we wanted to go outside the rye portfolio a little bit, and the other thing I wanted to do was link up Virginia and Kentucky, which were, again, a little sensitive subject, but Kentucky was once part of Virginia. Each colony claimed everything to the western seaboard, so we used a white corn supplier in Kentucky and wheat from Virginia as the secondary grain.
How hard was it to distill this using the historic methods at Mount Vernon?
It was actually pretty simple. We ended up adding a little bit more grain than we do for rye because the mash was thin enough that rowing was incredibly easy. As a rule, people say that rye whiskey is more difficult to mash than bourbon, any other type of whiskey, but I don't think that's true. It's just following the rules, right? And, as far as the manual labor behind it, it was very simple. We changed some things up as we went, but it was ridiculously fun, because I think, the more and more we look into the history of it, people just use what they had, so the idea of a specific mash bill, it had to evolve out of the fact that people had left over this or left over that, and that they were combining those grains so that they didn't go to waste. And, the idea of a regular mash bill was, in my opinion, was a luxury.
So how did the new make taste when it came off the still?
It's fabulous.
It was amazing. We were very pleased.
Yeah.
But as Lisa said, there was adjustments along the way, not just in the quantities, but she was there at the beginning, which was very helpful. Had to go do her, as we jokingly call her real job or day job, but you're always a phone call away, and that helped us to guide the first few days of fermentation, and then we kind of hit our stride with it. And then we also have become a lot better at making the cuts off the stills the last 2 or 3 years, and I think that played a role in flavor.
Yeah, and something that's unique to Mount Vernon is that distillate, and even more so in the bourbon than in the rye, it picks up the smokiness of the distillery a little bit. So it's interesting because it's not, people assume that it's going to be from smoked grains, and it's no smoked grain in it. It's just the fact that, the terroir of the distillery is absorbing those smoke flavor.
Because you've got the wood-fired stills,
Yes.
so that's where it's coming from.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So when do we actually get to see this in a bottle?
Minimum 4 years. I think we all agree you don't want real young bourbon, and so I want to hold some of the barrels for 4 and probably some longer. We also used a different cooperage this time. We went with Independent Stave, Cooper Select, which Lisa recommended for that profile of that whiskey we were making. So I look forward to how that's going to taste.
Yeah. We've been laying the rye down in Zach Cooperage out of Athertonville, Kentucky.
And you could do this as a bottled in bond, couldn't you?
Something to think about. I've been advocating a few new labels at Mount Vernon with my higher-ups because I do think a cask strength is also something we'd love to do down the road. And I think they're starting to see the light on that there's opportunities there.
And we should point out that all of the whiskey you sell at Mount Vernon, the proceeds go to benefit the educational programs.
That's true.
Which is important. It's an important fundraiser for the estate.
And Mount Vernon gets 1.1 million visitors a year, so you can imagine the wear and tear on that mansion. And in fact, this year the mansion's getting extensive work, some of the most work in a lot of years. So everything we make helps that, and it helps the educational program too.
Well, guys, good luck with the project. I can't wait to taste this bourbon in 3-4 years or whenever, as it sounds like it's going to be a killer.
Yeah, I bet if you stop by, Steve would probably pull a little bit for you.
Oh, it's all in that undisclosed location somewhere on the estate.
Yes.
He's the only one who knows where it is and has the key.
That's right.
I know where it is. I just don't have the key.
Right. Thanks again for joining us, Lisa Wicker and Steve Bashore from Mount Vernon.
George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon opened up for the season this past week. It's open daily for tours through October, and you'll find a link for more details at whiskycast.com. Along with our WhiskyCast HD video segment, showing just how they make whiskey at Mount Vernon using colonial-era methods and equipment. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at the website to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, along with the latest whiskey news, events, photos, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. We'd love to hear from you. You can always email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com, and you'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.